Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pair Program. Tim Winkler here alongside Mike Gruen. So Mike, we were kind of having a little chatter on this earlier today, but have you been following the Ovechkin goal tracker?
I mean, I have no choice, even though I'm a Rangers fan in DC. You kind of have no choice, but and it's it's a momentous thing. I have mixed opinions on it because but at the same time, like any records that can be broken, it's awesome. It's awesome to be alive during that time or whatever, and seeing it happen. And Ovechkin's certainly a prolific goal scorer who probably would have broken the record had it not been for COVID and for what was it, like a couple shortened seasons and other things.
A couple short seasons, yeah.
So
it's pretty exciting time. Just as of this recording, anyways. Like the other day he had 2 goals, and I think
he's
right
about
now
51, 52 out, something like that.
He's 52 out, but who's counting, right? But the record is held by Wayne Gretzky. As those listeners that aren't privy to this, is Ovechkin considered the greatest goal scorer, one of the greatest goal scorers in professional hockey. So up there with Gretzky, he's at 894. And Ovechkin's 52 goals short of breaking that. So anyways, I bring it back because it's kind of a good full circle from our first episode, and we both wearing our jerseys and giving some hockey love. But yeah, exciting time heading into playoffs. Hopefully for us. I know that you're in the race, but
yeah,
we'll see.
We'll see how far now that the Rangers have good coaching. We'll see if we can get a little further.
Yeah, we could use some players. All right, so let's talk about today's episode. So we're gonna again continue on this kind of deep dive into the pivotal role that technology plays in modernizing government operations. With this episode, we're gonna focus on the valley of death for startups in the defense sector. So to clarify on the valley of death, and more broadly, maybe just in tech innovation, this refers to a gap that startups face between, say, demonstrating the viability of their technology and being able to scale it to a point where they can secure investment and contracts and kind of sustain. So this covers areas like funding, like the funding gap. Obviously, like we'll talk about regulatory and bureaucratic hurdles, product market fit challenges, long sales cycles, and scalability and integration issues. So to add a little bit more context for our listeners and prep for today's discussion, to bridge the valley of death, there's initiatives like Small Business Innovation Research Programs, or SBIRs, which will be referenced quite a bit today, are pretty critical. And so what those are, they're providing non-dilutive funding to help startups develop their technologies to a stage where they're attractive for further investment or procurement. And as well, entities like Defense Innovation Unit and AFWorks, who is organizations we've had on in the past, they can help startups with navigating the complex defense procurement ecosystem, and help match technologies with opportunities within defense. But as I'm sure our guests will point out today, that all sounds great in theory, but it's nowhere near that easy, and there is a lot of work to be done to make that process work efficiently for commercial startups. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and intro our 2 guests that are joining us today. So we have Aneel Alvares. Aneel has a distinguished military background, former B-1 pilot and terminal attack controller with the Air Force. Also worked for a few years in the test and evaluation community. And Neil has spent the past 6 years with the Defense Innovation Unit in Boston. Aneel, thanks for joining us today. Alongside Aneel is Warren Katz. So Warren is a former founder of a dual-use startup, Mac Technologies, that was actually funded by Defense SBIRs and was later acquired. He was a managing director for an Air Force accelerator powered by Techstars. Also noting that was the first startup outreach effort by AFWorks. And then most recently, he's served as the chairman of a nonprofit, the Alliance for Commercial Technology in Government, which has a mission to streamline the integration of commercial technology into government operations. So both of you guys, welcome to join us on the pod.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Good stuff. All right. Now, before we dive into the discussion, we will kick things off with a fun segment called Pair Me Up. Mike, you kick it off. Why don't you lead us off?
All right. So I'm going with actually a pairing from my childhood that I'm seeing disappearing. So it's a disappearing pairing, and that is swing sets and playgrounds. It's springtime. I go on lots of walks. I don't know what it's like where you guys are, but in Montgomery County, Maryland, basically the schools have mandates. They can't have any fun things on their playground anymore. No moving. It's all about safety. I get it, but swing sets just are tough to find. And I have so many core memories as a kid growing up on the swings, playing around the swings, getting hit by kids on the swings, whatever it is. So that's my pairing. It's sort of a disappearing thing. I know lots of people have the little playground sets in their backyard, but there's something very different between those and the really big like swing sets that I grew up with at the elementary school. So that's my pairing today.
Sounds like a county problem to me. We've got parks popping up over here. I've seen some pretty interesting playgrounds popping up. But
could just be where I am. You could be, as I said.
What about? Are you guys seeing that? I don't know. Are you seeing a lack of playgrounds around?
The playgrounds exist. It's just the swing sets and metal slides and merry-go-rounds. Anything that might
merry-go-rounds for sure. I haven't seen a merry-go-round in a long time. Yeah, so I'm following you on that. Right. Yeah. Swings, I don't know. It's actually interesting. Like we've got a 15-month daughter, and we have yet to put her in a swing. So we're actually getting ready to do something this weekend. I'm pretty excited because I know she's going to love it. But swing sets were a huge throwback to childhood. But yeah, I don't know. I see them.
It could just be a county problem. I need to move.
Could be a county problem. We'll put in a word. Cool. All right. For my pairing, I'm going to go with something that's basically teed up perfectly for what we're all about here on the pair program. And that is pairing of a mentor with their protege. So that's a relationship that experience meets innovation and new ideas. Guidance helps kind of helps form those future, innovators or those future disruptors. I personally, would shout out a mentor in my professional career, a longtime friend of mine. His name's Chad. He always encouraged me to just got to take on risk, live outside my comfort zone, and help shape me into the entrepreneur I am today. So the mentor and their protege is my pairing for today. And I know that we've talked for countless hours about some of those relationships, Mike. But yeah, every guest that comes on this show, has some sort of a good mentor or has a good story around somebody that they have mentored. I'm going to pass it to our guests at this point. So, Aneel, how about a quick intro and your pairing?
Yeah, thanks. I think you pretty much covered my intro. Didn't mean to be a career Air Force officer, but that's about where I am right now. Probably a few more years to go. And the last 6 years, the Defense Innovation Unit's really been great. I spend most of my time in operations and trying to seeing the other side of the fence, acquisitions, and especially the way the Defense Innovation Unit does it has been eye-opening and a great experience. Quick note on the second to last pairing. If somebody hasn't invented it already, and I bet somebody probably has, you just need a video game swing set.
A virtual reality swing set.
That doesn't exist, unfortunately. I bet it's going to exist at some point. For me, that's an easy one. I'll go with one that's just kind of timely. I'm going to go with lithium-ion batteries and motors connected to wheels. We just not too long ago bought our first American car, first electric car, Tesla, and oh my goodness, I know I got a wife and kids and all that, and that brings me joy, but the Tesla, absolutely unbelievable. I have not felt acceleration like that probably ever, right? And I used to fly fighter style and bomber aircraft. I mean, it is just amazing. And I'm so excited that they went for performance. They prioritized that over every other goal. It's just an absolutely unreal machine.
That's great.
That's awesome.
You use the auto drive feature. How's that work for you?
I actually don't like it, right? Because there's so many safety features built into it. You pretty much have to have your hands on the wheels and the eyes facing forward. It's kind of pointless, and I love driving it. So I tried it once, and never again. I'm sure someday it'll be amazing. It's my opinion, not quite there yet, and I love driving the car.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, love Teslas. Awesome. Warren, how about yourself? Quick intro and pairing.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. So Warren Katz, I think he did a good job of introing me in the beginning. Entrepreneur myself, founder of a company, had a good exit, became an investor, pretty common arc. But I found that it was very, very, very difficult to get the best stuff sold into government, just a bunch of barriers. So dedicate a lot of time, last couple of decades, in how to grease the skids for commercial product companies that invested in something, built it, finished it, and now just want to sell it to the government instead of having it knocked off or remade or delayed or whatever. As far as my pairings go, at this point, I'm sort of like a quasi-retired guy, but so everything I do revolves around food and beverages and things like that. So from my childhood, I don't know if you guys know what a fluffer nutter is, but it's a sandwich that is made from peanut butter and fluff. And I think the reason why it was invented is to get kids to eat something healthy. You have to slather it in some kind of candy. So fluff is this marshmallow cream that I enjoyed, 100 years old. It's invented here in Lynn, Massachusetts, I think, is the Fluff Factory, actually. Still around after 100 years. Fluff and peanut butter on a fluffernutter is one of my childhood delicacies. And it is a telling lesson on how to get somebody to do what they don't want, slather it in candy or slather it in sugar, enticement of some kind to get them to do what they don't naturally want to do.
I definitely have strong memories of a couple kids at my summer camp who that was like their go-to every day. And then not wanting to get in the swimming pool with them because they always had like stuff all over their face.
Just covered in fluff.
Exactly.
Good stuff. And appreciate that fun fact on, the origination story of where it came from.
Yeah.
That's great. Cool. All right. We'll put a bow on that segment and move into the core of today's discussion. So the way I kind of see this conversation flowing, I think it'd be helpful to begin with just kind of painting the picture of maybe the current state of affairs and just making sure that our listeners are caught up on what SBIR programs entail, some of those different phases, how the programs are leveraged, and then some of those challenges that startups face in that journey. And then next, we can talk about the government reform that's needed for a healthier ecosystem. Warren, I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts on this topic. And then I did want to make sure that we covered something that, Warren, we kind of riffed on our Disco call, was the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, FASA, and the importance of this law. And we can talk a little bit about a few examples of how this law has proven useful in real world scenarios. So Aneel, maybe we'll start with you and just a little bit more context on maybe the current state of the ecosystem and a little bit more context on SBIRs as well.
Yeah, so it's probably worth clarifying. DIU actually doesn't use SBIRs at all. Our instrument of choice is the other transaction. So I'd be happy to talk about that. Warren, I know, lives more in the SBIR world, and he's probably better placed to talk about that specifically. But the other transaction is probably just as relevant to this discussion. I normally explain it something along the lines of, if you look at the federal acquisition regulations, normal procedures by which things are acquired in the government, it's like a 1990s New York City phone book. I mean, it is just enormous, with every potential risk mitigation measure under the sun baked into these things. And so what happens is that acquisitions officers and contracting officers apply all the risk mitigation measures that would be needed, that might even be a stretch, for the purchase of an aircraft carrier. They might apply that to the purchase of a small unmanned aerial system, which just doesn't make sense because the cost of implementing those risk mitigation measures probably far outweighs, in most instances, the total value of the risk that you're trying to mitigate. And so other transactions were actually created in the 1950s to allow NASA to move a little bit faster, and then they were updated again in the middle of the last decade. And by comparison, you have the New York City phone book example with an OT and other transaction. You start out with a blank sheet of paper, and then it's on the parties involved, the contracting officer, acquisition officer, the organization you're trying to do business with, to actually write in all the risk mitigation measures that are applicable to that specific acquisition. And there's oftentimes a lot of reluctance to do so, right? So it's like handing a chef a bunch of food or a bunch of ingredients and telling him or her to make something versus handing him or her a recipe. And for better or worse, most folks in the acquisition world would prefer the recipe than to just be handed a plate of ingredients and have to make something, right? But DIU does do that exclusively. We use other transactions exclusively, and it allows us to move much, much faster because the risk mitigation measures we're implementing are specific just to that acquisition. Now, the big difference between OTs and SBIRs, as is implied in the name or the full name, it's a grant, right? It's a tax taken off the top of the acquisition budget that organizations are allowed to use to fund small businesses to, research and develop capabilities that they think they're going to need, versus another transaction is purely just an contracting method, acquisition method.
Interesting.
Perfect. Yeah, that's helpful. I didn't point out in the intro kind of the OTs. So appreciate you covering that and building a little bit more awareness on that as well. We'll dig deeper into some of that as well. But Warren, why don't you, if you want to kind of just quickly expand on your 2 cents on it, and then we can keep going.
Yeah, so Aneel is exactly right. An OT is a contract type, a contract structure. In fact, many of my companies have had their phase 2 SBIRs use an OT as the contract mechanism. So they're two sort of orthogonal things, but can use each other. The SBIR program is a grant program exactly like Aneel described. It was developed about 40 years ago, the early 1980s. And the best way to describe it is it was kind of like a government seed stage venture capital fund. They take what's today a 3.2% tax off the entire R&D budget of the entire federal government. This is not just DOD, it's the entire federal government. So it's about $4 billion a year now, and that cash is given back to the same people it's taken from. But when it's given back, it's got some strings attached. You have to award these grants in a phase 1, which is anywhere between, I believe, on the low end, $75,000 today to a high end of $250 for a phase 1. And if the company's successful, they can be awarded a phase 2, which I believe is up to $1.9 million today. So a fairly significant chunk of change for a really small, innovative startup company at the pre-seed level can help the company avoid taking venture capital at that most expensive stage of the company before they start de-risking the product. And then if they want to take venture capital later, then they can, but they're in a stronger position. They can keep more of their equity. So I view it as a very attractive alternative to taking very early stage VC for a lot of these deep tech, hard tech companies. I myself built my entire company only on SBIRs. I never took any venture capital, which I highly recommend to anybody who can possibly do that. Because when you do have an exit, you have nobody to share the money with, which is a wonderful thing at the end of the rainbow. But a lot of the companies I'm an investor in, or I've helped through the Techstars Accelerator, do both. They take SBIRs and raise money through angels and venture capital. And the government is starting to recognize and encourage that, especially through things like the Air Force's TACFI and StratFi programs, which are wonderful phase 3-ish follow-ons to the phase 1, phase 2 SBIR program. A lot to talk about with SBIRs. It's a wonderful thing if you know how to use it right. Has been abused over the years by companies that view it just as sort of a corporate welfare sort of thing. You've heard of the term SBIR mills. We can go to a whole conversation on SBIR mills. So it has been abused by some, and Congress is trying to figure out how to put the screws to that. But a wonderful, wonderful program, funds a lot of companies, funds a lot of, if you look at the greatest successes out of the SBIR program, you get companies like Amgen, Qualcomm, 23andMe, Ginkgo Bioworks, iRobot, AeroVironment, Broadcom, at least pieces of Broadcom. These are multi-billion-dollar companies that got their start out of the SBIR program, went on to raise venture capital and do other things, but phenomenal ROI for government dollars. I'll stop here and see where you want to go.
Yeah. So, Aneel, we were talking a little bit about on our discovery call of like some of those pitfalls of where you go once you hit a certain plateau. If we want to maybe expand on that and just kind of this will just kind of pick apart a little bit of some of those pain points with the way the system's currently kind of structured, and then we can flip it back to Warren as well.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Warren completely. I'm a huge fan of the SIMBR program in general. But see, I guess depending on where you sit as a stakeholder in the innovation ecosystem, it's important to understand the nature of what you're dealing with, might be the best way to say it. So, I oftentimes find myself at conferences and talks, in sidebar conversations with companies that have received a SIMBR grant, and they think they're on the fast track to a big government contract because they have a SIMBR phase 1. And some education is probably warranted there, where getting from a SIMBR phase 1 to a transition is just unbelievably difficult because you have this whole thing called PBBE in between: planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. So like Warren said, you got this. I misspoke earlier. I said a tax on the acquisition budget. Warren said it correctly: a tax on the R&D budget is what it actually is. Then organizations get some of that funding to hand out to small companies that they think are developing capabilities relevant to their mission. But you think about skin in the game, right? So if somebody gives you free money and they tell you have to spend this in a certain way, and if you don't, I'm going to take it back. It's not like you get to keep it. Of course, they're going to spend it, right? Whether or not it's going to yield some kind of long-term benefit for them, they're almost definitely going to spend it. And as a recipient of that money, you may not, necessarily see the incentive structure behind that organization that's spending money on you. So as a company, what I normally advise them is it's really important to understand where the requirement is coming from for whatever it is that they're receiving that money from. And it doesn't have to be a requirement, but ideally it would be. If it's not a requirement, if it's just a DoD or a government organization giving them a SIMBR phase 1 grant, that's fine as long as they understand that that's what it is, right? Maybe it's $50,000 for a SIMBR phase 1 grant, and then it's going to end. That's great. It keeps the lights on for a few more days. But it's really just understanding what the end game is. So I said a little bit more about the ideal is if there's actually a requirement behind that end game, right? So if there is an organization in one of the services that has a hard and fast requirement for some capability that doesn't quite exist from a technical perspective yet, and they, in conjunction with an acquisition organization, are handing out this, maybe a series of SIMBR phase 1s to help develop technology that is going to fulfill a funded, vetted requirement someday, that's the holy grail of what companies probably want to be looking for, right? But that's really tough to find. And as a company, you can kind of prod your government handlers into trying to figure out what that is, or at least explaining to you what the nature of the end game in that particular case might be.
Is there any situation in which they're doing that where it's that same requirement and they're doing it across multiple companies, and I assume that they, as the government, I'm not just going to pick one horse. I'm going to bet on a bunch of ponies. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm not as well versed in the SIMBR world, but I don't think AFWERX is doing this anymore. But in their first few years, they were awarding something like 1,500 SIMBR phase 1s per year. And so if there are particular tech areas where the Air Force, really needed some concerted development, they're probably going to hand out a lot of SIMBR phase 1s to companies in those areas.
I want to kind of jump right into a little bit more specific with what the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government is doing. So this is a nonprofit that you all formed, and expand on a little bit on some like these use cases how you're getting involved, and then why what these big areas that you feel there's room for reform.
Yeah, so it does follow on exactly to where Aneel left off. I'll point out one thing about the SIMBR program and how its money is spent and who it's given back to. It's given back to researchers in the research community. So for the first 35-ish years, a laboratory researcher in his white coat in the laboratory gets this money back and spends it on a little company to try to make a product. It wasn't necessarily the case that researcher himself or herself actually knew the end user warfighter and who was going to use the thing, and didn't really have a connection to the actual end user of the product. And then the company finishes their prototype, it works. Then they go back to that research scientist and they say, I have no clue who would actually buy this. The company, it's thrown back on the company to go find the end user, learn about what this requirement process is that Aneel was alluding to, and then start the PPBE process to get money aligned for this brand new thing nobody ever thought of in the DoD. And that is the valley of death. Whereas the company thinks, oh my God, you're Mr. Research Scientist who gave me this $2 million. You're in the Air Force. How do you not know who would use the product at the end? How do you not have this all set up for me already so that this process is smooth? The federal government's a very big place. The Army itself is a big place. The Air Force itself is a big place. So this went on for 30 years. So the company essentially thrown into this 5-year-long or plus, or even bigger than that, process of understanding how things get products get built, and the product is finished and ready to buy. And so it's this horrible problem. So what we do at the Alliance is try to make that gap nothing, bring that gap down to zero, so that as the company is making the thing, the end user is already engaged right at the beginning. The end user can kibitz on what they need and don't need. The requirements are either being set up or already are being broadened to include the possibility of this new thing. And the budget is, you may have heard of this PPBE reform thing that just dropped, a suggestion for how to make the budgeting process better, to make the budgets a little more general purpose, so that when a surprise new thing shows up out of nowhere, the money is already in a budget to buy the thing, even if the requirements process didn't foresee it and didn't specifically design it. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's kind of what the Alliance is trying to do. Go to Congress and work with Congress to figure out how to take advantage of surprise technological developments, whether they came through the SBR program, came through a DIU OTA, or came 100% from commercial venture capital backed private companies that finish the thing on their own nickel or on a VC's nickel, and then magically show up at the end and say, hey, I got this thing. You didn't think of it. It's done. Our adversaries around the world are buying it. They're giving it to their war fighters on the battlefield. They have it today. Do you want it now? Instead of having the U.S. war fighters wait 5 years to get this thing, or even worse, creating this unfortunately, this happens even to this day, creating a new program in the DoD to pay a large defense prime by the hour to remake the thing that was available today for billions and billions of dollars, have our warfighters be forced to wait around for a decade, and then be handed something that's already obsolete, that's worse than what our adversaries have been using for a decade. And all the while screwing over that little startup company that had the thing finished, or stuck their own neck out, risked their own capital, took VC money, and finished it and got to the finish line, taking out all the risks that Aneel was talking about, that phone book that he's talking about. All of that risk mitigation is all in the developmental part of developing a product, okay? If a private capital, if those companies finished it on their own, all those risks are gone, yet the government still, attempts, in a very blunt fashion to apply that phone book of rules to the company that already finished the thing. They already de-risked the whole thing. So none of those risk mitigation bureaucracies and processes are appropriate anymore. Yet the phone book is still hurled at the company that finished it already and took all the risk out. So that's what the Alliance does. We're trying to make the DoD and the government a warm, receptive customer, so that the second a hot new product, technology, or a company shows up at the front door, they are sucked in like a vacuum cleaner, whisked through the process directly to the end users who might use the thing. The product is quickly assessed. It shouldn't have to meet all of the requirements that a fantasy process. We can talk about the requirements process, but basically it's a bunch of guys in a room that smoke dope and spitball and fantasize about sharks with laser beams on their heads and space vehicles, space motorcycles, and come up with this fantasy list of requirements that the prime contractors love, because then they engage in a fiction writing contest to write this proposal they know full well that they can't make. But then the government sets aside billions of dollars and they start making it, and 7 years go by and they say, I'm sorry, we can't do sharks with laser beams or space motorcycles. It was just too hard. But give us another $10 billion and we'll try a little harder. And it's a monopoly at that point, and it's too big to fail, so they can't shut it off. That's the requirements process. Fortunately, there are laws on the books that say, you know what, if a commercial item shows up and it meets some of the requirements and it's better than what the warfighter is using today, you have to buy it off the shelf from these companies. You have to. We have a legally mandated preference for buying finished commercial articles over remaking from scratch in developmental programs. The problem is that those laws are just not, that's FASA, and those laws are not obeyed. They're ignored. And then you ask a PEO, a government contracting officer, they won't even believe it exists, those laws, because they're so completely unenforced that it's like treated as like it's not there. So bottom line, that's what the Alliance does. We are trying to make it so that the innovator shows up, they're swept in, sucked up, and their product is purchased in massive quantities very, very quickly with the least amount of friction. That's our goal. They ain't there yet, but that is our goal.
Yeah, and I believe what you're referring to as well is like the legislation that you kind of shared with me, that draft legislation anyways, the Small Business Commercial Transition Program. That's what you all are taking and presenting to Congress?
Yeah, so that's actually, looks like it's going pretty well. There's going to be the chunks of that whole legislation is going to come out very, very soon. It may be part of the 2025 SBIR reauthorization legislation itself, because the SBIR program is up for reauthorization in 2020, 2025. Yeah, it's formalizing that smooth transition from the phase 2 prototype into phase 3 full-scale production, which really doesn't exist at this point. The closest thing to it is the Air Force's STRATFI program, which is part of, it was AFWERK's attempt to do exactly this. And it's a 3-way funding program between some SBIR money, some venture capital money, and some warfighter end user acquisition money, which is great. It's awesome, because that is a bridge essentially from prototype into full scale production. But it's only for the Air Force. It's a little restrictive right now. So essentially, this Small Business Commercial Transition Program is more of a formalization of this throughout the entire DoD. Treats the money a little more flexibly. I think it's wonderful, obviously, but we'll see what Congress thinks about it and whether it actually gets in the legislation.
Very interesting. Aneel, we can kick it back to you. I know that you had an idea of it that came to mind about the SBIRs as well that I think you were going to touch on, or you could just pick up where Warren kind of left off as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll do the latter. I was thinking it might be worth just jumping up to the 50,000 foot view here to make sure we get a holistic view of how this works and where what we're talking about fits in. I'm sure most Americans were like me before I went into the military, assuming that the Air Force, Army, Navy, Space Force, Marines fight wars. But they actually don't. They're just force providers. They train and equip the force. In law, that's all they do. They don't fight wars. Instead, the U.S. has split up the world into some number of combatant commands. There's a combatant commander for each one of those combatant commands, like Indo-Pacific Command, European Command, Africa Command, etc. And those are the organizations that actually fight wars. The services just provide forces to those combatant commands. And so the services, given that model, don't necessarily know what's needed for war fighting. I mean, I take that with a grain of salt. They kind of know, but the combatant commands, the ones who are actually fighting the wars, should be the ones who really understand what they need to fight wars. Right? So for the most part, it's the combatant commands that are writing requirements and then passing those on to the services to fight about and decide what's going to get funded and what's going to get executed in terms of acquisitions. So if you're in European Command and you decided you need a loitering or, a ton of loitering munitions to hang out over Ukraine, and you write that into a requirement and hand it off to maybe the Army or the Air Force, that's kind of like how requirements get generated from that grassroots level. And then they kind of filter upwards through the chain of command. And then when they get to the top of the services again fight about it, decide what they're going to put forward in the president's budget. That's how that PBBE process gets started. At an absolute minimum, that's going to take about 2 years to go from requirements after the requirement is decided upon for it to get vetted, thrown into a president's budget. Congress fights about it. ASK and SASC staffers, House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee staffers are going to fight about it. So realistically, in probably 3 to 5 years, you're going to see what's called a program element line in a National Defense Authorization Act that funds the procurement funding that gives an acquisition organization the procurement funding to go out and start executing on that acquisition, right? So you talk about some captain in European Command writing this requirement. 3 to 5 years from now, there's going to be the funding to actually go after that requirement. The Ukraine war might be over, obviously, right? Hopefully. And that's the start of the acquisition process, right? That's the starting gun, which is really a shame. And then you think about tech development cycles that are, probably 2 to 3 years, you're seeing massive advances. So if you write a requirement for something in 2024, you're going to have the funding for it in 2027 or 2029. I mean, the tech's going to be far different from what you thought it was back in 2024, right? I mean, the whole system is just so antiquated, literally from the 1960s. This is the McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, Vietnam era method of acquiring for the Department of Defense. And that PBBE Reform Commission that Warren mentioned was intended to try to update it. I haven't actually seen the results. I didn't necessarily know they were out there, but it'll be great to take a look. So with the SBIR process, what oftentimes happens, like with organizations like AFWERX, is that companies present AFWERX with things that they think are of importance to the Air Force. Right? Some Air Force major, lieutenant colonel says, "Yes, that looks interesting. Let's fund it with a SBIR Phase 1 for $50,000." And then, like Warren mentioned, let's say they even get a SBIR Phase 2, so a little bit more money to really develop the capability, and now it's somewhat viable. It's on that company to try to figure out what requirement to match that up to. And for someone that doesn't know the inner workings of the Air Force, it's virtually impossible. When I said in the National Defense Authorization Act, there's going to be a program element line that gets handed off to what's called a program executive officer. And so the Air Force has, I don't know, like 14 or 15 of those. They're broken up by functional area. So there's PEO for fighters, PEO for bombers, PEO digital, et cetera. They're the ones that execute the acquisitions. Then within each of those PEOs, you're going to have maybe a GS 12 to 14, so kind of like a mid-level officer civilian that's going to be handed or tasked with leading that acquisition. So what are the chances that GS 12 or 13 that's developing the acquisition strategy is going to actually get married up with this company that might have the perfect solution to that acquisition that has that SBIR Phase 2? Like, there's no mechanism to make that match right now, not in any kind of repeatable way. That's really unfortunate. You got the alliance trying to bridge that gap, and some of the legislation Warren's putting forward will hopefully bridge that gap. But that's really the fundamental challenge. I think with the SBIR program is you start with some amazing solutions that then have to go find the problem, right?
All right.
Now I'll interject here that AFWERX implemented a major fix to their SBIR program about 3 or 4 years ago, where a company is not allowed to submit their Phase 2 proposal without that end user warfighter customer signed on to be a customer. And this threw a huge wrench into the SBIR program because, to be frank, a lot of these companies, the SBIR mills certainly didn't really care whether there was an end user. They were doing SBIRs for that, just for the SBIR money. So they flipped out that now there actually has to be an end user customer involved, and I actually have to deploy a warfighting item. That was a very unusual new thing. And a lot of the scientists who were using this money as free science money inside the government were also a little pissed off because, whoa, you have to actually have a real use case here for this item. This is just free, funny money, as Dr. Roper called it, resort cash. When you go on vacation to a resort and they give you the free wampum points, it's free money. I don't have to do, So anyway, that was a major, major change, which did piss off a lot of people in the ecosystem. It was a major, beneficial, really positive change. At least now, the companies, you can't go forward and get money unless there's actually a real user at the end of the rainbow. Now, whether the real user actually has a requirement and the budgetary line to buy more of the stuff when the phase 2 is over, that problem didn't go away. But at least at this point, the company has an actual customer that wants the thing. If they finish it, phase 2 SBIR usually takes 2 years, $2 million. Maybe they don't actually finish the thing. Maybe somebody leapfrogged them in the interim. So that was a major, major beneficial change, at least on the Air Force side. And then I will comment that the Navy has always done a little bit better job connecting their big programs with the SBIR program. But that went a little too far in the Navy, in that the Navy programs themselves started using their SBIR just to shore up defects in their big ongoing programs. So they kind of blended that SBIR money into their acquisition program, and therefore there were really no innovations, new products being developed. It was just being used as supplemental programmatic money. So it's being adding into acquisition. So they went a little too far on the Navy side. They have a tremendous transition record, the Navy, to transitioning SBIR products into Navy programs, but their innovation, metric is poor because they've been treating it like contract money, not like venture capital to develop a new product. So there's still, unfortunately, a huge gap in the requirements and the PPBE for something surprising and new, but at least the Air Force, with both StratFi and this MOU signature requirement for an end user customer, did kind of connect the dots a little better for the phase 2 companies.
So it sounds like, like we're solving on the one side, right? There's these solutions in need of a problem and trying to marry that up. Going back to the earlier and the backdrop to some of my favorite stories from my friends who actually served overseas, and all of the in-field innovation and stuff that they had to do because they couldn't get what they actually needed. And it was all on the, sort of the backdrop for that was, right, technology that they needed was really difficult to come by. Is there anything being done on that side to sort of help with that captain and saying okay, I have this requirement, but I can't wait 5 years because by then whatever I need it for is going to be gone?
Well, so there is a shortcut, and Aneel did a great job of describing the plate of ingredients handed to a chef, and the chef's got to do it. So I have a similar analogy that may be a little different. I think Aneel got a chuckle out of it. I view the defense acquisition system as a Swiss cheese. So meaning that you can enter if you have a big block of Swiss cheese, you can enter at any hole, and as you're passing through the middle, you can exit any hole you like. If you're smart enough to know which hole you're given the hole you're entering, but you're smart enough how to navigate inside, you can exit any hole you like. Okay, because it's so complicated and intertwined. But there is the ability to say, look, if I want something fast, and this is where FASA and FAR Part 10 come in, which are the regulations that should be mandated and enforced a million times more than they are. And a lot of our legislative effort is about enforcement of FASA and FAR Part 10. Step 1 is to do what's called commercial market research. And it's the most important step that's usually either ignored or short shrift. If a captain on the firing line wants an article, this is the first thing that he or his PEO, program manager, can and should do is commercial market research. Step 1 is scouring the planet for anything close that's done and available and buyable today off the shelf. If it's close, you're legally mandated that you're supposed to buy it, and you can buy it immediately. If you've got the cash sitting aside and you have the requirement, or you have a broad enough requirement, you're supposed to buy it. Now, so these are two impediments, having the cash and having the requirement, okay? How do you solve those two things? Well, FAR Part 10 has a magnificent clause that says if the commercial item that you found doesn't meet all the requirements, you have to do two things. One is you have to go back to that captain, that warfighter, and say, hey, Captain, we found something that's pretty close. It's missing these 3 features. Is that good enough for you? And if that question ever gets asked, the captain invariably says, yeah, hell yeah. I need it now. I'm fighting here. Okay, I can't wait 7 years for the perfect. The perfect is the enemy of good enough. This thing that you brought me is good enough. Give it to me right now. I want it right now. Okay. If the question, legally required question to be asked, usually doesn't. Okay. And the second thing that has to happen is if that captain says, you know what, those 3 features that are missing, 2 of them I can do without, but this one I really, really kind of need. Well, then the procurement person is supposed to go back to that commercial vendor and say, hey, we'll buy a bazillion of these from you, but you got to add this one feature. We really kind of do need this one feature. That question also legally has to be asked. And of course, any vendor in their right mind is going to be, of course I'll add it. Well, tell me what the feature is and we'll negotiate it. But if you buy 38,000 units of the thing, yeah, I'll add it. I'll add it on my own nickel, no problem, okay, if the quantity is high enough. So that's what FAR Part 10 says, okay? So if the procuring officer, program manager is doing their job, they're trying desperately to find the close enough commercial item and trying to match make with the needs of the warfighter and get to yes and get that warfighter that thing instantly, okay? But the problem we have is that the frozen middle, the program officers, the PEOs, the contracting officers, and the prime contractors that are making all their money from making everything from scratch because they sell their time by the hour. That's how they make things. They actually don't have much interest in getting to yes, okay, for that captain. They have interest, unfortunately, parochial interest in getting to know. Getting to know means they all make more money. Getting to know means that program manager, that contracting officer, they're going to have a 20-year-long job. They're going to have to be able to run this multi-billion-dollar program for decades. They're going to have job security. They're going to have cachet. They're going to have credibility, a huge budget, huge influence, huge staffs. Unfortunately, it's these parochial interests that sabotage the market research mandate that we're talking about. Now, if the incentives were changed so that those people were somehow deeply rewarded for getting a yes, then that's what would have happened. Then we'll go back to the Swiss cheese, okay? Then they will come out the hole that says, you know what, that commercial item is good enough. I swear it's good enough. I'm going to beat up the captain and twist his arm to make sure that the commercial item is good enough for him, and I'm going to beat up the vendor so they put in their 1 or 2 missing features, and I want to be done with this in 30 days. I want to be finished and on to my next procurement thing in 30 days, because if I get stuck on a decade-long developmental program, my career is over. So it's by changing these incentives that the people in the middle will change their behavior, and they will try to get to yes instead of what they're currently doing, which is trying to get to no.
That's an amazing summary of like my experience. Like I haven't spent too much time in government, but like the perverse incentives that just exist that really slow things down, move things in the wrong direction. And it's just, that's the way the system is. Like, oh, we have this money, we have to spend it. Like, we're not incented to save. We're not incented to do things quickly. We're not incented to buy a commercial off the shelf solution. We're incented to create our own and build. So it's a fascinating deep dive.
I learned this, unfortunately, in 1994 when the first commercial products of my company were coming out, and I'd show up at the program managers, I'd show up at the prime contractors, and after a while they would be earnest and honest with me. They'd look me in the eye and say, Warren, this product does do everything we need. It's perfectly suitable. It's done today and it's cheap. It's 1/10 the price we're going to pay. But please, Warren, understand we make all of our money by remaking this crap over and over and over and over again. We have no interest in buying your off-the-shelf item. It will be too cheap and it'll end too quickly. Okay, I'm sorry to bring you this sobering news. And I had government PMs who had enough respect for me to look me in the eye and tell me this to my face on more than one occasion. And at that point, as a commercial product owner, it's like, what do I do? Where do I go? Okay, and that's why this arc of my career took that turn 30 years ago, because of that honest, answer that I got. So I've been trying to change the incentive structure and the enforcement. You got to have both, carrots and sticks. You have to have incentives and enforcement, both. Otherwise, this just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I love how that became a part of your journey. What you're doing with the Alliance from, what you experienced early on as an entrepreneur. And that's kind of, the picture we're trying to paint for a lot of our listeners that are, maybe building something, or especially if you're dual use, right? Like protecting yourself on one side to, make sure you have revenue coming through the door if it's on your commercial side, while you're, kind of working the lanes on the federal side. So it's again, I don't think we're here to paint like the grimmest of grim pictures, but the reality is it's not, it's no cakewalk. And those timelines that you just described, Neil, I mean, that's daunting, considering how quick tech is moving. And if you can't innovate within that gap of shorten that 3 to 5 years, it's an issue. So, love that the reform is being pushed and by folks like yourself.
So there is actually another maybe exit hole, to use Warren's analogy, out of that Swiss cheese. So I mentioned before, combatant commands, they fight wars, they don't buy things. That's a little bit fungible, right? They do have operations and maintenance budgets that they can spend in the current year for capabilities. And more what we're seeing, especially out of the most relevant tech, is that a lot of companies are selling their tech as a service, right? And so that's something combatant commands can buy as a service in the current year with current year O&M, operations and maintenance funds. I think that's one of the best models because you're getting the latest tech. You don't ever have to take ownership of physical things, and you get what you need instantly, right? So some examples like satellite services in the run up to Ukraine when Putin was amassing forces on the border of Ukraine saying, no, we have no intent to invade Ukraine. That was commercial satellites out there that the government was buying from commercial vendors. The government was buying the imagery from commercial vendors. That was not, multi-million-dollar government satellites producing that imagery. That was commercial imagery that the Biden administration was able to put out to the public because it was completely unclassified, all bought as a service. There's a great company on the West Coast, Sail Drone, wind and solar powered sailing vessel. They launch out of somewhere in California. I can't remember where. Sail to wherever in the world you want. You have your sensor package on the vehicle. You never take ownership of the vehicle. You just kind of like buy time with the vehicle. But there are some great models out there where combatant commands can buy things with current year O&M funds. And one other thing to mention, so Special Operations Command has pretty much always had the ability to buy things. They've had procurement budgets, so they've always been a little bit unique. In the last maybe year and a half, Congress gave Cyber Command that same authority as well. So there are now actually PEOs being developed in Cyber Command. I think there was the realization that the services were buying capabilities that were too disjointed for a national strategy with respect to cyber. So now Cyber Command has that capability. I had the opportunity to talk with some HASC staffers and members about this. With the creation of Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funds, which have now dried up, hopefully they'll be replenished. But when that fund existed, that essentially gave U.S. European Command and the forces over there the ability to spend current year funds out of that USAI pot to buy capabilities in the current year to then give to Ukraine, right? Which is just an amazing model that a combatant command could do that. And what we're trying to point out is that if other combatant commands like U.S. Indo-Pacific Command had that same capability, if there is, hopefully not, but if there is a shooting war over Taiwan in the future, why wait until the war starts? Give that combatant command that capability to buy things now. So then you have those captains out there in the combatant commands who know what they need, who can just buy things right away without having to go through the entire acquisition ecosystem.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, I'll foot stomp on the SOCOM thing. They are the best at buying, and they are very different for two main reasons. One, they're going on a mission in 3 weeks. They turn around to their procurement people and said, I'm going on a mission in 3 weeks. I don't have 7 years to wait for whatever you fantasize up. What do you got? Okay. I need what you got right now. Okay. That's one thing. Also, their budgetary and requirements processes are compressed. Their budget line items are extremely few and extremely broad, just like that PPP commission was recommending for the rest of the military. And their requirements process, I think I saw their requirement was like anything at all that might help SOCOM with their mission is like their one requirement line. So pretty much any product at all in the world that helps them with their mission falls under it. So they've managed to compress their budget and their requirements down to nothing. And the urgency just means they don't develop anything. They can't. So I always point all of my companies, you got some hot noodle thing, go to SOCOM first. Go to SOCOM first. Go to SOCOM first. If they like it, they'll just buy it, and they can. and they will.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I am curious on those companies that you kind of advise, or maybe they come through the alliance. How many are you working with at any point?
The alliance has about 50 members, and I, as an investor, I had 30 companies go through my Techstars program, and we had two other programs, the Space Accelerator that my buddy Matt Kozlov ran out of Los Angeles, and he had, I think, 3 or 4 classes with 10 companies each. There's another 40 companies there. I helped them out when needed. My other colleague, Jonathan Fensky, ran the Allied Space Accelerator for 2 rounds. He had 20 more companies. So the number of companies that I have touched through Techstars have been like 100-ish, something like that. Also, the AFWorks guys, I pretty much will take a phone call from almost anybody trying to get through the process. I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with companies in this, all the way from a company saying, Warren, I was giving you a name. I've heard about SBIR and I've heard about DIU, but I don't know if I want to get involved. Tell me about it. All the way to companies that are like, I'm struggling to get my phase 3 OT production contract out of my phase 2 SBIR, and this, that, and the other combatant command has a requirement that we think can help me morph the requirement or change the budgetary line item or talk to this guy. So I get, conversations, the whole spectrum. The number of companies I've talked to who are trying to get in or have gone through just about to the end is in the hundreds. And so the Alliance has about 50 members at this point. We're always looking for more, but most of those companies are DIU and SBIR companies who are well into phase 2 and are struggling and confronting that valley of death. They're the ones we've been most productive for.
And Aneel, I'm curious with like your time at DIU, how many companies do you ballpark, I guess, on the number of companies that you kind of get involved with or interface with, and then say like maybe in like a given year?
Yeah, so me personally, it's been fewer than DIU as a whole. I've been mostly on the defense engagement side, so working with defense organizations to figure out what their needs are that might be able to be fulfilled by commercial tech or modified commercial tech like DIU specializes in. Also, you see far fewer companies and far fewer solicitations out of DIU than out of the general cyber world. And the reason is, I'll just take AFWorks as an example. Historically, they've tried to look for anything that might be of relevance to Air Force missions and try to build those up. It's a lot of things, right? So they wind up giving out, like I mentioned before, a lot of phase 1 grants, cyber phase 1 grants. DIU has historically taken the opposite approach, where we work with defense partners, as has been my role for the last few years at DIU, figure out a very narrow problem that we can address, and then look for companies that can address that very narrow problem. And then we also try to figure out the transition pathway, who's writing all of the documentation that's needed to create that formal requirement if a requirement doesn't exist, what general officer or civilian equivalent is going to push that through the process to make sure it actually gets approved and vetted. And so it hopefully spits out as a PE line in a program element line in the National Defense Authorization Act in a couple of years. In other words, most of the time, we're going to have to try to figure out what that transition pathway is for those small number of firms that we work with so that they actually get the abilities into the hands of end users at scale. So in a nutshell, we start with a very narrow problem and then look for a small number of appropriate solutions versus the cyber process. And it varies by organization. So I'm mostly just focusing on the Air Force here, where they're largely looking for a large number of solutions. And then it's mostly on the companies to try to figure out what problems those can get matched up to. And actually, AFWorks has changed that in the last year or so. So that what I just described was what they call the open topic, but they've created something called the specific topic in the last year or so, which is a little bit closer to the DIU model of going to the PEOs, the program executive officers, those top-level acquisition organizations to say, what do you need? And then putting those out there as topics where they want companies to apply to those topics.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think I want to put a bow on the main conversation and transition to our final segment. There's probably hours and hours more of this conversation we could be having, but we'll save that maybe for a follow-up discussion. Let's transition to the final segment at this point, which is the 5-second scramble. Quick rapid fire Q&A with both of our guests, some business, some personal questions. Mike, why don't you go ahead and tee us up with Aneel, and then I'll I'll jump to Warren.
Aneel, here you go. I'll give you a second to catch your breath. If you could have a 1 hour mentoring session with any tech giant, who would it be?
Man, I just sung the praises of Tesla. I was about to say Elon Musk, but I don't know. I want to take that one back.
It's probably the number one answer that we get, really.
Is it really?
Yeah.
What's the best piece of career advice you've ever been given?
So it wasn't really advice from a person. It was actually a course that I took, Air Command and Staff College. It was a leadership course. It was a Harvard Business Review article on vision, which I always thought was a stupid sign that hung up in offices. But when you read about when I read this article, it really changed my view on leadership and management in general. Leading to something, that's what the vision is. That's what you form your team around. That's it in one sentence. But that's really shaped, I think, how I operate at work more than anything else.
Cool. What's one cultural value you think is really important to foster?
There's the standard ones that hopefully your parents taught you when you were 3. So I'll skip those, like the integrity and all that sort of thing. But no, I don't know if I call it a value, but coalescing around a vision for any organization and rallying people around that vision is I found to be really critical.
Cool. I suspect there might be a theme. In a word, what's the biggest challenge facing like the defense tech space right now?
One word.
Or you can use a phrase. I was expecting you just to say vision.
No.
It could work.
It can be really offensive, but I'll say it anyway. People.
What was that?
People.
What type of technologists thrive or people in general in the defense tech space?
Should thrive or actually thrive?
Actually thrive.
Unfortunately, it's process-oriented folks.
All right. What was your childhood dream job?
Astronaut.
If you could live in a fictional world from a book or movie, which one would you choose?
Oh, man. My wife and I are watching Stranger Things right now. But we got to skip that one.
Terrifying.
Terrifying. That's not the one I'd choose.
Yeah, same. It's just the first thing that popped into my head.
That's good. What's the most outdated piece of technology you can't live without? Or just can't let go?
I don't know if I'd say it's outdated because I use these things all the time. But, I'm renovating my entire house and I still find myself like a hammer all the time. I have nail guns and auto hammers and everything, but I have a physical steel hammer that I use continually.
Sounds good. I don't think that'll ever go out. At least not until we have the AI robots doing all the pounding. What's a charity or corporate philanthropy that's near and dear to you?
I'd probably go with, I wouldn't say near and dear to me, but the one that kind of the approach that I respect the most is the Bill and Melinda Gates type approach of treating it like a business from soup to nuts. You want to do the most good for the most number of people. And moving away from the mom and pop model to what we know via our capitalist world is the most effective way to get things done.
And finally, if you could instantly be an expert at something, what would it be?
Programming.
Cool.
I took C and I shouldn't even say this. I'm old. I took Fortran. Like that's the only language I actually programmed in. So modern language would be awesome.
Fortran, I believe, is still in use. I have friends over at NASA. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Good stuff. All right, Warren, let's knock this out and then we'll wrap. What is your favorite part about serving as chairman for the Alliance?
It's to get to see some of what I've proposed to staffers and congressmen actually show up in legislation. It's very rewarding to see that sausage get made and a little sentence or two here and there, or a concept actually make it all the way to the finish line. Actually, one good example is that open topic thing Aneel mentioned that was pioneered by AFWorks. Actually, they stole it from NSF, and then in 2022. And they pioneered it and made it very successful in 2022. It came out in the SBIR Reauthorization Act of 2022 that all of the services in the DoD are now required to have an open topic once a year. So for a huge arc starting in 2018 or so, finally through a piece of legislation, and they sabotage it and they don't really do it right, but at least it's in law at this point.
What's one myth about working with the government that you want to debunk?
One myth. It is actually just people. So you do think that it's just this giant phone book of process, but you know what? That giant phone book of process was invented by people who were sitting in a room writing it up at some point. And even some people in the government sometimes say, "Oh, well, the process says this," and the process. Wait. That process was invented by human beings at some point in the past. So it can actually be uninvented and unmade by another room full of human beings. Okay, wasn't passed down by God to Moses on the mount with the twin tablets. We can actually modify this. We're allowed to modify this. So that's and that actually is not from people outside the government. It's people inside the government who feel that these tablets that were handed them 30 years earlier are not modifiable. No. In fact, we can modify this if it makes sense.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone looking to invest in defense tech startups?
Make sure it's a dual use investment. So if a defense thing goes tango uniform, as they say, or just winds up getting delayed by the average 5 years before it gets procured in large quantity, that you have a fallback, that you have multiple paths to realize the success. And by the way, that's some of the advice I give a lot of companies who are thinking about bidding on the SBIR program. I tell them, don't count on the government, the DoD, being your large scale purchaser of these things when you're done. Take their money as free venture capital, bootstrap your commercial product, and be successful commercially. And if the government does show up later as a customer, wonderful. But treat it as free venture capital. Take your idea, put a hat, perfume, and lipstick and pearls on this pig, make it look like what the government wants to buy, but have a commercial market in mind.
Great advice. Who is a mentor in your life that has influenced your professional career?
I would have to say Leonard Nimoy, or Mr. Spock. He's my childhood hero, and it's so pleasurable being logical about things. So yeah, I would say Mr. Spock.
What's an app on your phone that you can't live without?
Probably Waze.
What's the biggest fish you've ever caught?
I actually caught a 54-inch striped bass once, and it was not a keeper. I had to send it back. That was a very sad day.
54 inches?
Striper in Rhode Island waters, yep.
My God. What's a charity or corporate philanthropy that's near and dear to you?
Besides the Alliance for Commercial Technology and Government? I would have to think very, very hard about that. So there's plenty. And actually, along the lines of what Aneel was saying, there's a charity in Boston called Build, BUILD, that funds high school children to start up little startup companies in their high schools, so that the lure of entrepreneurship convinces them to go to college. I thought it was a very, very interesting thesis and concept. So I volunteered there, donated money. That was great. And then I'm an animal guy. I love cats. I'm surprised one of my cats has not graced us with his or her presence during this podcast. They usually show up at inopportune moments. But the Potter League for Animals is a charity in Rhode Island that my wife and I are involved.
Cool. What's the worst fashion trend that you've ever followed?
Worst fashion trend. I think I had bell-bottom pants back in the 70s. I seem to recall way back then. Don't have any anymore. And my fashion dedication. So I have a mullet, okay, and I've had this mullet now probably for almost 50 years, and not at all a mistake. And I'm bringing it back all by myself.
It always comes back.
It's coming back. It
all comes back.
Absolutely.
Bell bottoms are back.
Nothing.
I have to have one final bonus question just because of your animal shirt collection that you tipped us off to at the beginning. So what's your favorite animal shirt that you've got in your collection?
Oh, that's a great question. This one I'm wearing right now is really up there. But actually, the one I gave out when I ran the Techstars program, I gave Dr. Roper one of these shirts, and I'm really kind of mad he hasn't worn it yet publicly. But it's a giant cat fighter pilot in sunglasses. I gave hundreds of these out to everybody, but that's got to be my favorite. Is the cat kitty fighter pilot.
That's solid. That's awesome. All right, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure having you share your experiences with us. And I know driving change in the government is no easy task. So appreciate you on the efforts that you're making and pushing us forward, and grateful for your time on the pod. Appreciate you joining us.